I mentioned last week that there is a series of blog posts that Dr. MacArthur is publishing in regards to the social justice agenda in the church. And I want to read a little bit of what he wrote this past Monday. This would be the first of the first part of the larger section of what he's attempting to get into. He writes these words, quote, "When I was studying doctrine and apologetics in seminary, I thought I was equipping myself to defend biblical truth against an onslaught of attacks from the world. I envisioned answering atheism and confronting threats to the gospel that would arise out of secular culture, the entertainment industry, the academic world, and other places outside the church. Sometime after I entered full-time ministry, it dawned on me, to my profound shock, that the greatest threats to biblical truth typically arise from within the fellowship of professing believers, and it is a relentless parade of attacks. Looking back through church history, I realize that's how it's always been. There's never been a time when false doctrines, harmful methodologies, unwholesome practices, bizarre beliefs, poisonous ideologies, and false teachers weren't troubling the church of God, often with seriously divisive and otherwise spiritually destructive results." And here's how he summarizes it. From the earliest days of the apostolic era, faithful Christians have been called upon to contend earnestly for the truth of the gospel. The hardest battles have taken place within the visible church, among those who claim fidelity to Christ. That's because the greatest threats to gospel truth have not come from atheists or other overt adversaries, but always from influential voices that arise within the church who speak twisted things. And he references Acts 20, verse 30. It's interesting, isn't it, that MacArthur points to the reality that there's always been difficulties in the life of the church. In fact, even in this very blog, if you read it even further, he alludes to the history of the church at Ephesus as an evidence of this trend. I pointed out parts of this last week, and I want to go back and approach this again. The church at Ephesus is one of the most popular churches in the New Testament. It's one of the most visible churches in the New Testament. Paul, you remember, was there, had spent 3 years at Ephesus in Acts 18 and 19. He had spent 3 full years in that place teaching them, leading new people to Christ, and teaching the believers there the depth of the Christian faith. And Paul then, when he left, had gone into Macedonia, down into Corinth, spent some time there, and on his way back to Jerusalem, he pauses in the city of Miletus, and he calls for the Ephesian elders. Remember Acts chapter 20? He calls for the elders of the church at Ephesus to warn them of men who would be arising from amongst your own selves, who would be speaking twisted things. Acts chapter 20, verse 29 and 30, the passage that MacArthur alluded to. After that, then, after Paul had gotten imprisoned, wound up in Rome, he wrote a letter back to the church at Ephesus. And he outlined in the letter, and we spent, a year in the letter, outlining the divine nature of the church in the hope that the people of the church would grasp these truths at the core of who they were and hold fast to them. So he writes a letter back to them saying, here's what the church really is, so that you know what to stand firm in. Now, here we have Paul writing another letter to the Ephesian church through Timothy to confront the issues he had warned them about from Miletus. So in Acts 20, when he speaks to the elders, now here we are several years later, and Paul's writing saying, this is precisely what I warned you about. This is precisely what has come to pass. And then, of course, the last look at the church at Ephesus comes in the book of Revelation, when Christ himself will confront the church for its embrace of false apostles and losing its first love or its passion for the original truths of Christ that are contained in the gospel they originally heard. Now, notice the pattern. Every single time the Ephesian church comes up, the issue with it is the truth in that place and how they have fallen away from the central message that the apostles delivered. Paul preaches there, and then when he leaves, a couple of years later, he comes by and he warns them that this is what's going to happen. And when he gets to Rome, he writes to them about what they're supposed to really be. Now he writes through Timothy to the church saying this is precisely what has happened, and even Christ himself condemns the church for its lack of faithfulness to the original message. This has been going on for centuries. This isn't new. This isn't new. It's the same thing time after time after time. The church is defined by the boundaries of its doctrinal truth. This was the primary point that we brought up last week. The church itself is defined by the boundaries of its doctrinal truth. The church of Jesus Christ is not defined by its success. It's not defined by its size. It's not defined by its programs. It's not defined by its relevance. There's a word that you see all the time in literature involving churches. We're relevant. It's not defined by its worship style. It's not defined by its celebrity pastor. It's not defined by its cutting-edge nature. Or most importantly, its doctrinal looseness. Someone gave me an advertisement this week from a local church here in Baldwin County that's looking for more people to come, and right on the very slick brochure that they sent out, it says, "You will fit right in. There's no rules and rituals here." And I'm thinking, now that's a church I really want to go to. There's no rules there. No rules at all. That's great. I mean, I can just turn the kids loose in that place and say, go. Just rip the curtains off the wall and just do what you want to do because there's no rules, right? Now, of course, that's ridiculous, isn't it? And they wouldn't agree with that at all, but yet that's how they advertise themselves, right? The church today seems to want to define itself by all these kinds of things rather than by its doctrinal truth. And so here's the problem, folks. The church ceases to be the church when it embraces something other than the apostolic gospel. I don't care if you call yourself the church. You're not a church if you're not embracing the totality of the apostolic gospel. When you've decided that your church is more defined by its celebrity pastor or by its worship style or whatever else it is that's on the slick little brochure, you're not a church. So this letter, 1 Timothy, is a charge to Timothy in this regard. And so far we've looked at the substance of this charge that Paul has given to Timothy, right? The nature of the charge. Paul says to Timothy, challenge the heterodoxy that has invaded the church. Restore sound doctrine to the core of this church. Lead people away from the endless speculations that have detracted them from the main goal of being a follower of Christ. In other words, the what of the charge is confront error. Okay? The what. What's the charge? Confront error. And then we looked last week at the aim of this charge. Why? Why do we want to do this? The answer, of course, is to speak in fellowship in love. Why is this charge necessary? Because it's loving to do so. It is unloving to not tell people the truth and to allow them just to drift away into error and destruction. It's loving to confront. I know, that's so very opposite of our culture, but that's how Paul thought. The origin then of this charge is a pure heart, a clean conscience, and a sincere faith. From, where does this charge come from? Where does it originate? It comes from the very character of Christ himself. Christ-likeness is the essence of what this charge is about. What is the goal? The goal is Christ-likeness. Its nature is confront what is wrong. Its aim is to do so in love. Its origin is from a sincere faith, a Christ-likeness. But now, starting in verse 6, we come to the target. When you have a charge and you're charged to attack or confront, you have to have a target. Who specifically is leading the crusade of different doctrine? This is the who question. Timothy's told, confront. Natural first question, who? Okay, so Paul's going to now tell us who. And not only is he going to tell us who, but he's going to actually tell us what the method is that these who are teaching these false doctrines are using. So he's going to give us a who and he's going to give us a how at the same time. All right, so go to verse 6. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Notice Paul begins by saying certain persons. Okay, don't miss that two-word phrase. Paul lays this issue at the feet of specific people. You see it? Certain persons. This is not a generic or general kind of problem. This is a problem that's being perpetuated by specific individuals. It's not a generic problem, a general problem that can be addressed just by hoping it'll go away. That's not going to work. This is being perpetuated by specific individuals. By the way, in chapter 1, verse 20, Paul will name two of them, Hymenaeus and Alexander. He's going to put specific names behind this, although there are only two of probably many others that are being addressed here. The target of Timothy's charge is specific people. Timothy will need to address actual people with his authority. He's going to have to confront literal people and contend with them. Let me pause here for a moment and note something with you. One of the most difficult aspects, one of the most difficult yet necessary aspects of being an elder of a church is having to address specific people issues in the church. It's one of the most difficult things. It's particularly difficult in churches with a single staff, with a single elder, single staff churches, which, by the way, are the vast majority of Baptist churches. Just having one man who serves as the elder of the church leaves him with the entire responsibility of dealing with all of the specific people issues in the church. I thank God for these other men who serve as elders here because we together work on this issue of how to deal with specific people issues in the church. This is called formally church discipline. Discipline. Church discipline. You remember that one of the ways in which the church was defined by the reformers, as to how they defined what a church is they said a church has three specific marks, three things that identify a church and separate it from everything else. Now, it's not worship style and celebrity pastor and programs like I mentioned earlier. The reformer said there's three things which constitute a real church. Number one is that it's a place where the word is taught and preached. And they put that first because I think they're right in the sense that the very most important thing is the preaching of the Word of God. A church is a place where the Word is properly preached. Second, a church is a place where the ordinances are properly practiced. The Lord's Supper and baptism are applied into the lives of the people on a consistent and regular basis in accordance with the Scriptures. But the third mark, and this is the one that most churches ignore entirely, is that it's a place where discipline is appropriately applied. A church is only a church if it preaches and teaches, executes the ordinances, and holds its people accountable to what it means to be a follower of Christ. We're not a church if we just let things go for a long period of time. About a month ago, there was a big hubbub in the secular press about a church, I think it was in Kentucky, I don't remember, that decided to purge their rolls. And they sent a letter to all of the various peoples in the church that hadn't been there. So they sent out like 50 letters to all these different people. And somebody posted it, of course. Here we are in the social media days. Somebody posted it on their Facebook page. And the press got a hold of it. And it's like, oh, this church is so unloving. They just don't love people. They're kicking people off the roll, blah, blah, blah. Well, here's the problem with that. Everybody missed the point. And the point is this. The church should have been exercising discipline all along so it didn't have to send 50 letters. It should have been analyzing and keeping track of its membership and saying, who are these people and are they participating in the life of the church or not? And if they're not, what are we doing about it? And if they're not going to participate, then guess what? We're not going to call them a member anymore. You can't wait 15 years and then throw 150 people off the list all at once. That's not discipline. That's just cleaning house. That's all that is. Sometimes discipline may involve excommunicating those who fail to live up to their covenant. But it is a necessary aspect of the life of a true church, of a real body of Christ. Paul is telling Timothy, listen, your charge is going to be to deal with people, specific people. Nobody likes confrontation, right? It's not our favorite thing to do. We don't relish it, but it's necessary. Paul says, listen, here's the deal. Certain persons are doing this, so you're going to have to confront certain persons in it. You're not just going to be able to sweep this under the rug as some sort of generic problem and hope it goes away. You're going to have to go to individuals. You're going to have to deal with them. But then Paul says, these certain persons have swerved away from these. They have swerved away. They have, the word, by the way, swerve comes out of the King James Version, okay? That's why most modern translations hold the word, because it was in the King James, and so a lot of times modern translations like to hold on to words that were used in the King James because people have gotten used to it over the years. Okay, so they've taken this word swerve and they've used it. But basically what it means is to deviate or to abandon. To deviate or to abandon, to stray away from, to depart. These false teachers have swerved away from, now what are the these? The these are from the previous verse. A pure heart, clean conscience, and a sincere faith. So they've walked away from these three things. They've walked away from these Christ-like attributes. Given that a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith are all Christ-like attributes, these false teachers have abandoned teaching towards these things in the lives of their students. In other words, their goal of teaching is not to lead people to a purity of heart and a clean conscience and sincere faith, but something else, which we'll get to. Let me remind you of something that ought to be obvious. It's not always obvious to people, though, but it is. Heterodoxy never, ever has godliness as its goal. False teaching never has godliness as its goal. What is the goal of false teaching? What's the goal of teaching something that's not biblical? What's the goal? It is most often designed to lead people away from the pursuit of holiness or godliness towards ourselves. It's designed to teach away from a focus on Christ to a focus on me, a focus on us. In the blog post that I didn't read all of earlier, MacArthur goes on to list the number of specific issues that he has faced in his tenure. The various kinds of things that he has listed along, that he's had to deal with. He's written, as it turns out, he's written a book to each one of them at each time that these issues came up. And so he listed each of them in the book that went with it. And if you go back and look at the list, and I won't give you the whole list, I'll have you go read the blog post, but if you go look at the list, every single one of them are basic doctrinal things that come up in the life of the church, which are fundamentally self-focused. Self-focused, all about me. Let me just give you 3 examples. One of the first ones that he had to deal with was charismaticism. The whole issue of the spiritual gifts and, that sort of thing, and the inordinate focus on spiritual gifts. I remember those days when everybody in the church was doing a spiritual gifts inventory, remember? I mean, everybody was getting one at the door and you had to fill it out, and then your entire life was dependent on how you scored on your spiritual gifts inventory, right? Remember those days? Yeah. Preaching was not high on my list. I don't know why. But it was a self-focused kind of thing, right? And he had to write a book about it. It's about us, right? It's all about me, what I'm gifted at, what I'm capable of, what I can do. He had to deal with the psychotherapy movement that moved through the church. After the spiritual gifts inventories, you remember, came the days when we were doing personality tests even in the church and using various psychotherapeutic methods to figure out who we were. Some of you don't remember this because you're way too young. But it's back in the days in the 70s and 80s when churches were busy talking about us understanding ourselves. I remember that vividly. Understanding ourselves. And you need to understand yourself. It wasn't about understanding yourself in terms of how the Bible speaks about you as a sinner dead and lost and so forth, but rather just getting to know yourself. And he had to write a book on that. And then now, and the one he's going to be dealing with now, but it's been around for a long time, and that's the issue of pragmatism. The focus on the seeker, using worldly methods to draw crowds, the megachurch model, the whole picture of, if it works, do it. That's what pragmatism is, by the way. If it works, do it. Because if it works for that church over there, it's obviously got to work for ours. And if Bill Hybels up there in Illinois can make it work for his church, certainly all of us out here in Hinterlands can make it work for ourselves too, right? Although Bill has admitted now that his model doesn't work and he's fallen to sexual sin, and so he's gone. So like all other fads, they disappear with their celebrity pastor that let him out. The bottom line is that each of these situations, each of these realities are self-focused. It's a focus on us rather than upon Christ. False teaching always leads away from godliness. It always leads to an inordinate focus upon individuals. You can visit the websites of churches, even here in the county, and listen to the preaching. And this is what you'll hear. Me, us, we, aren't we great and special? And no mention of the holiness of God or the need for us to pursue holiness in our own lives. So Paul says they have swerved away from these things. They've swerved away from what really matters. And the result of this is they have wandered away. They have wandered away. Swerving from these, they have wandered away into vain discussion. They've deflected or turned away. The word here, wandered away, literally means to turn your ankle. Ever turned an ankle? Been running, turned an ankle? How well do you stay on the path after you've twisted your ankle? You keep going on a straight line, right? You're still making it towards the target, right? You may be, no, you know what happens. You twist your ankle and it's like, oh, you're over here and all of a sudden you're off on the side of the road. That's the picture that Paul's painting. You've wandered away from this original track that you were on. And it says they wandered away into vain discussion. Vain discussion, fruitless talk, meaningless talk, babble. Stuff that doesn't matter in the eternal scope of things. A focus on stuff that is inconsequential. Doesn't matter. It's just stuff to talk about, Have you ever noticed how easy it is for attendees of the church to talk about anything and everything other than theology? Have you ever noticed that? We can come together in the church and we can talk about everything under the sun. In about 6 days, we're going to have a new topic to talk about. And it's going to become our topic du jour, isn't it? And every Sunday we're going to come in here and that's what we're going to be talking about. Whether it goes our way or not. And notice how much easier it is for us to have conversations about the weather and about football and deer hunting. Well, maybe not around here, but in Kansas. And the list goes on, things that we can talk about so easily. The inconsequential conversations that take place around us is what Paul's talking about here. Wandering away into vain discussion. Because as those who have been rescued by this Christ, those who have been rescued out of the wrath of God that is to come, you would think that we, more than anyone else, would want to get together with one another and talk about what it is that this God has done. I mean, it's monumental what he's done. There's simply no way to talk it out all the way. There's simply too much to talk about. But yet, what do we do? So easy to talk about that which is inconsequential. Going back to the whole point of MacArthur's blog series, maybe one reason why the church is so divided along racial or social or economic lines is because its focus is on temporal things rather than eternal things. Well, let me ask it in the form of a question. What would happen if the people of the church spent more time talking about Christ than about themselves? What would happen to those divisions amongst us? What would happen to those? Would we care? Paul paints a word picture here I don't want you to miss. Now, he wouldn't have been able to see this in his day. But as we talk about the who, because that's what we're talking about, the who is who is Timothy supposed to be addressing here? Here's the picture that Paul paints. Now, just think about this in your mind. It's those who have swerved to miss an obstacle in the road, have abandoned their vehicle, and are now wandering around in the woods, oblivious to their original destination. Imagine you're driving down the road and you're going 55 down 104 and a deer jumps out at you. You're going to swerve, right? But you swerve to miss the deer, you wind up in the ditch. You get out of your vehicle, you abandon it there, and you begin wandering around in the woods nearby, completely oblivious to your original destination. You're on your way to Target, and now you're wandering around in the woods oblivious to the original destination. That's the picture that Paul is painting. The initial event of swerving to miss something has now left the whole church in the woods. They've missed the obstacle, which is discipline in following Christ. The obstacle is discipline in following Christ. They've missed it. So now they've abandoned their vehicle. They've abandoned the gospel. They've abandoned the apostolic message. And they're now wandering around in the woods. They're wandering around in their vain discussions, talking about everything and anything other than Christ, oblivious of their original destination, which was godliness, holiness, Christ-likeness. They've swerved from one thing and wound up someplace else entirely. Those who have swerved to miss this obstacle. What makes this so very difficult for us is because we're guilty. So now, Paul says in verse 7 what the issue is. That was the who. The who are certain people who have swerved from the original destination because of an obstacle in their way, are now wandering around in the woods. So Paul says, here's what the wandering around in the woods looks like. Now I want you to notice something in verse 7. Paul here is going to transition in this verse from the who to the how. Who to the how. He's going to mix the two concepts together, but then starting in verse 8, he's going to turn hard to the how. All right? And we're going to hold that thought till next week, Lord willing. But he wants us to see the connection between the who and the how. Who has swerved and how they have swerved. He's going to mix them together. All right, you'll understand what I mean in a minute. He says, desiring to be teachers of the law. They desire to be authorities over others, is what he means. Governing the beliefs and actions of others. Twisting what is good into something other than its original intent in order to hold others under their power. This, by the way, is the most common trait of divisive people in the church. The most common trait of divisive people is they want power. They want to be able to control how the rest of us are thinking. They want to be able to control how the rest of us are acting. That's divisiveness. That's what Paul's talking about. These are people who desire to be authorities over others. All right, now let me prove my case here. The entire phrase, desiring to be teachers of the law, is one word in the Greek. Nomo didaskalia. Big word. One of those 25-cent Greek words, right? It's a single word describing religious authorities. It's used in only two other places in the New Testament. Once in Luke 5:17 and once in Acts 5:34. And it's applied in both cases to Pharisees and other teaching officials. In fact, it's applied, here's the irony of ironies. It's applied in those verses to Paul's mentor, Gamaliel. It's applied to Paul's own mentor, his own rabbi, Gamaliel. Now we know, don't we, as we've studied the New Testament, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests and the other religious leaders, the scribes, were notorious for holding people under their authority. Were they not? They were notorious for holding people under their authority. The Pharisees had invented more than 600 different specific regulations that you had to follow to be a good Jew. And they demanded that everybody, including Jesus himself, keep all these different individual regulations. Why? Because it was their power over people. They held people under their authority. Jesus himself says you'll go 100 miles to make a convert out of a man in order to bring him and make him a child of hell just like you. The Pharisees were notorious for controlling people through their application of religion. Their application of law. That's the word Paul uses here. Taking this thing called the law and applying it to people's lives and saying, you will conform. You will conform. And this is what churches will often do, right? Establish the rules. You want to be a part of this church? Then do this, and do this, and do this, and do this. Oh, and of course, don't do this. And don't do this, and don't do this. And as long as you're not doing these things and you are doing these things, we will consider you a good member of the church. Now, if those things are the pursuit of godliness and holiness, fine. But that's not what most often it's applied. Most often it's the specific regulations of behavior. Not too long ago, actually a couple of years back now, the president of a Bible college and seminary came and spoke at a conference that I went to, and he had a question and answer period in the afternoon. And I was there videotaping as part of my job with the conference in question. And so he got up and they started asking him questions. And somebody in the back asked him, he said, what do you think is the biggest problem facing children or people coming into your school nowadays? And he didn't even bat an eye. He said, dress code. Really? That's your biggest problem? I mean, these people can't define the word justification, but they're wearing the right clothes. Notice the way this is put together. Controlling, not in terms of what matters, but in terms of what doesn't matter. And Paul says they are without understanding, and they make confident assertions of things they don't fully know or able to define and apply. They think that they know what they're talking about. They think they understand. Well, I think the Christian gospel is this. But Paul says, here's the real problem with these people. The real problem with these people is not only do they want to exercise authority, but they want to exercise authority using a lack of information to do so. Now, that's bizarre, but unfortunately, I've seen it over and over and over again. MacArthur has seen it over and over and over again, and the Apostle Paul has seen it over and over and over. People who put themselves in positions of thinking that they get to have power over others, yet they have no idea what they're talking about. But by golly, somehow they manage to get themselves into positions in which they start dictating how the rest of the church is supposed to go. And this becomes dangerous. Heterodoxy starts from these things. In fact, you remember that Jesus himself often questioned the understanding of these nomodidascalia. He often questioned them. I just picked two examples. John 3:10. Jesus answered Nicodemus, "Are you the teacher of Israel and yet do not understand these things?" He came to Jesus to say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't get what you're talking about. Jesus looked at him and scratched his head and said, you're a teacher of Israel and you don't understand this stuff? In Mark 12, Jesus said to the Sadducees, is this not the reason you are wrong? Because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? These were men who were the religious leaders of the day. They were the studied ones. And Jesus looked at him and said, you're stupid. Well, he didn't really say that, but he meant it, right? You're wrong. You're wrong because you don't know the Bible, you don't know the Scriptures, and you do not know the real power of God. You've got a substitute for both. You've invented a theology, and you're applying it to people in order to hold them under your control. They desire to be teachers of the law. They desire to be authorities. That's what heterodoxy leads to. Do you understand what I'm saying here? False doctrine in a church is perpetuated by people who are looking to gain power over others, more often than not. They claim to be experts, but they're ignorant of the true ways of God. Thus, they teach the people what is wrong and control them under this false teaching. And because the rest of us don't know any better, we listen. So Timothy is told by Paul, your charge is directed at specific peoples, not just some general idea. You've got specific individuals in your church that are clearly teaching what is false, and they're using their false teaching. They've swerved away from what is good. They're using their false teaching in order to build themselves up as authorities and control the church. It is wrong, and you need to address it. Now, one of the reasons why I find this particular passage difficult is because it's personal. And here's what I mean. One of the common arguments that's made against preaching as central to the life of the church and the life of the believer is derived from verses like these. Now, let me explain what I mean. There are people out there who will ask questions like this. Why do we need preaching when we're perfectly capable of discovering what the Bible says to us on our own? I mean, I've got a Bible, you've got a Bible, And I'm perfectly capable of reading it and understanding it, so why do we need preaching? Why do we need to submit ourselves to this form of worship with its inherent dangers? And why? I mean, why bother? Now, I think it's a perfectly legitimate question. Here's the problem with it. I think there's a lot of people who have asked this question and then automatically answered it for themselves. And the way they've answered it is, well, we don't need preaching. So we're going to establish our church to be something other than a place where preaching is central. See, music is going to be more important to us, and the programs that we have in the church are going to be more important to us, right? And our budget's going to be more important, and all these other kinds of things that we're going to do. Those are really going to be what's going. We're going to diminish the importance of preaching because, well, the fact is that we're all capable of understanding God anyway, so we don't really need preaching. And you see, the fact is, when you look at something like this, you say, well, I mean, couldn't you apply these verses to me? So here's where it gets personal, right? Certain persons, and you all point at me, right? Certain persons, him, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, because that is the best description of his sermons I've ever heard. Vain discussion. He desires to be a teacher of the law, but he hasn't got a clue what he's talking about. Because first of all, I don't agree with most of what he says. And secondly, I really don't want to get stuck here every week having to listen to an hour-long babble by this guy. Now, I must confess, I spent a lot of time in my office this week walking around and going, what do I do with that? Because you see, if you will notice the connection is this. A lot of modern-day churches have abandoned preaching. And part of the reason that they've done so is precisely this. They have not so subtly, sometimes very subtly, but sometimes not so subtly, have said, you know what, we think there's other things that constitute worship that are more important than preaching. I'll give you a classic example is how many churches have a worship leader? They have a titled position in their church called a worship leader. And which part of the service does the worship leader lead? Well, the music part, right? And then he sits down when the pastor gets up to preach. So the implication being the worship is everything prior to the preaching. And then the preaching, well, we just live with that. And if we can find a preacher that does like 20-minute homilies, perfect. We get 40 minutes of singing and we get 20 minutes. There's a lot of people who would be really thrilled with this. Preacher, why don't we just have a service one week where we don't have any preaching at all, just singing? Right? Let's just have a singspiration. Heard that before? Let's just have a whole service with just singing. People would go, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that. Okay, I'd turn that around and say, how about if we just have a service with no singing and only preaching? Oh, that hurts. No. Right? So you see the built-in assumption of a lot of modern American minds, which is that preaching isn't all that important. And so I had to wrestle with this question. What if I'm just guilty of exactly the same thing that Paul is talking about here? Certain persons, having swerved from the truth, are leading us all into vain discussion. So what's the difference, right? What's the difference between what I'm doing here, or what I'm supposed to be doing here, and what they're doing in that scenario? What's the difference? And I must confess, it was not easy to deal with. Let me point out something. Heterodoxy is almost always spread by those in positions of power and authority. Always. Virtually all of the early heresies of the church are named to the individual who promoted them. Arianism, Pelagianism, Nestorianism, and the list goes on, right? And most modern heterodoxies are associated with a primary individual. Revivalism is associated with Charles Finney. Pentecostalism with Charles Parham. Prosperity gospel with Oral Roberts. The seeker-sensitive movement with Bill Hybel. There's usually a name associated with these individuals. And so wouldn't it be a fair statement to say, as a rebuttal to my point, right? Wouldn't it be a fair statement to say, well, look, and you, pastor, are just propagating the same thing. You're just standing up there and preaching. We are assuming you know what you're talking about, but we don't really know. You could be leading us astray. You could be leading us, into vain discussion for all we know. So what's the difference? Am I the certain person who has swerved from these and have wandered away into vain discussion? I desire to be a teacher of the law and to exercise authority over you, but I haven't got a clue what I'm talking about? Oh, and by the way, notice at the end it says, and they make confident assertions. Because one of the hallmarks of preaching is to be assertive, isn't it? What's one of the primary complaints you get out of some preachers? Well, I'm not really sure what he said. One of the worst things that you could say to a preacher is, good speech, Pastor. Not really sure I understood what you were saying, but you said it well. You kept me awake. The problem with preaching, of course, in our day, one of the other reasons why preaching has fallen on hard times, is because when you make assertions, when you stand in front of people and make assertions, you are automatically assumed to be arrogant. Don't tell me what you think, because what I believe is as important as what you believe. That's our culture. Our culture today is, you believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe, but don't you dare try to proselytize me to your position. And if you do, then you've offended me. And I will call you a bigot because you haven't embraced what I believe. How dare you contradict me? You want to pick a fight on Facebook? You want to pick a fight? Just make an assertion of some sort. And guess what will happen? You know it as well as I do, right? So this is one of the problems we have. We live in an age where in order to actually preach, which means to stand in front of people and assert what is true, you find yourself being rejected because people assume that you're just arrogant in saying such things. So now you see my dilemma. I'm really stuck here. I make confident assertions. Nobody wants that. And who knows whether he knows what he's talking about or not. And so it goes. Yet, isn't it interesting that Paul, in the second letter that he sends to Timothy, will tell Timothy, preach the word. So Paul makes an assumption here, doesn't he? Paul here is arguing against, notice what he's doing here, he's arguing against people who are preaching, quote unquote. They may not be used in a pulpit to do it, but they're using their position, whatever it be, to hold authority over people and to bring them along in their false teachings. They're making confident assurances. Paul says they don't know what they're talking about, but they're making confident assurances. But then he turns around and says, do the same thing. What's the difference? Now I know what you're saying. Maybe there isn't one. No, there is one. And the fact is, it's so simple that it's almost unimaginably simple. There's always been a significant difference between preach the word as a method of leading people to Christ over against preaching, quote unquote, which is designed to build up the preacher and lead people to him and his ways. Notice the difference. The difference is the goal. The goal of heterodoxy, the goal of false doctrine, is to lead people away from Christ, as I said earlier, and where to? Either to themselves or to the preacher, the one exercising the authority. But the true preaching of the Word of God is to focus the people on Christ. The focus of the true preacher of Christ is to lead the people to godliness and to Christ focus. False teaching invariably leads to a self-focus and away from godliness. So it's not about the methodology, it's about the goal. And that's the problem with heterodoxy. Heterodoxy says, well, I've decided to make up a few things that I think are true, and this is what I'm teaching, and this false doctrine I'm teaching, and I'm doing so because it makes me look good. The goal of preaching is to focus the attention of the hearer on Christ. The fruit of the preaching in the lives of the hearers is the test of its validity. The fruit coming out of the lives of the people who are sitting and listening to it on a regular basis is the test of its validity. That's the difference. See, because there was a point where I'm going, I need to quit because this is me. But then I realized, wait a minute, the difference between these people that Paul's talking about here is they only have a self-focus. They only have a focus on themselves and what they want to get out of it. They want to be, quote unquote, teachers of the law. They want to exercise power over people. They don't know what they're talking about, but they make confident assurances in the hope that people will say, well, he must be right or she must be right, so I'm going to follow them and do what they say and so forth. And they're led away from Christ and to the individual, or away from Christ and to themselves. But genuine preaching says no. It's about Christ. And the one thing that MacArthur is going to say in this blog series, I can predict him now. He's going to say that the real problem with this social justice agenda that's being pushed into the church today is it's a focus on us. It's not a focus on Christ. It's a focus on us. The danger of all of these movements is that they turn attention away from Jesus Christ and they turn attention to us. We become the central focus of what's going on in the lives of the church. Think about it this way. How many churches advertise themselves as a place where you can get something? It's all about you. It's all about what you can get. Now, yes, the church should be a place that you get something, but here's what you should get. You should get confronted with sin. You should get accountability. You should get discipline, and you should get godliness. If that's what your church is advertising, great. But that's not what most flyers that you see from these churches are actually advocating. So let me turn this to you. It is your responsibility. Okay, now I'm going to go from preaching to meddling now. Okay. It's your responsibility. It's the responsibility of the people of God to assure that they are being regularly taught by people committed to sola scriptura and to a focus on Christ alone. Whose job is that? It's your job. It's your responsibility. You're supposed to be asking that question about everything that comes out of my mouth, everything that comes out of the Sunday school teacher's mouth, everything that comes out of your children's teacher's mouth, everything that comes out of anybody exercising any kind of teaching authority in the church. Are they leading their students to Christ? To Christ-likeness, to godliness, to truth, sola scriptura. Which means, I think, that every Christian should be sitting consistently under solid expository preaching. Because that's what expository preaching is. Expository preaching is, what does this passage say, not what does the preacher say. You can go visit typical churches in our day, listen to some of the sermons, and invariably it'll be a message of, well, I want to talk to you today about how you can have less fear in your lives, you can have greater faith, and so if you'll open your Bible to Exodus 14, I'll show you how that's true. Well, wait a minute. That's not what the point of Exodus 14 is. The Bible speaks from itself. The Spirit speaks from the text. A good preacher, an expository preacher says, what does this passage say to you? What does this passage say? What is God saying from it to you? And second truth is that every Christian should be analyzing what they're hearing as to its biblical conformity. We should all be Bereans who are sitting down and asking, is this true? Is what is being preached here true? Is this what the Bible actually says? Is this promoting a Christ-like, Christ focus, or is this promoting something else? So we should be analyzing everything. And that's okay for us to do. Because you see, I think a preacher who truly wants to preach what God says is not afraid of someone asking, is that what it really says? Because I can say, you won't believe me, but I can say for sure that I want every week whatever I say to be true. I want it to come from God's Word. I don't want it to be my opinions. I want it to be what God has said. Now, sometimes I'm going to stick my opinion in. But hopefully you will be looking through that into what it says to say, is that what God has really said? Has God really said that in this Word? So preaching isn't just me talking and you sitting. Preaching is me talking, you analyzing, thinking, saying, is this really true? Is this really what the Word of God says? Is this really what the Spirit of God would say to us? Okay, so notice what Paul has done here. He has done a who job here. The who job is, who is this going to? Timothy, there are people, specific, certain persons in the church that are leading the church away from Christ-likeness. You will need to confront them. Not just their message. You will need to confront them. That's why this gets so personal. And difficult to preach, I might add. But the fact is that I think that Paul is being very clear with the church. Do not allow people, individuals, certain persons, to derail the primary message of the church. Don't put your head in the sand. Confront as you need to do so. And the Lord will then use that to His glory and to His honor.